By early 1943, the Japanese Empire was at its height. The country had occupied Malaya and Burma, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies, Indonesia today. These territories had become vital sources of strategic supplies such as oil and rubber. Now the United States laid plans to roll back the Japanese gains. The aim was to cut the country's supply lines by seizing the occupied territories. Japan could then be gradually strangled to death. But to win in the vast expanse of the Pacific, the US would need to develop new forms of mobile warfare. They would be based on amphibious landings supported by aircraft flying from carriers. The Japanese, unable to match American firepower, resorted to increasingly desperate measures. The country fell back on ancient notions of military honor to create suicide units. The result would be a terrible loss of life. This would be a decisive phase in the war in the Pacific and would mark the end of Japan's dreams of empire. But this was to come. Back in the spring of 1943, the US military chiefs faced a dilemma. They had been presented with two options for the defeat of Japan. The flamboyant US Army General Douglas MacArthur, commander of the US and Australian forces in the Southwest Pacific, favored a primarily land-based route. His idea was to seize the Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, and the Philippines. They could then be turned into a strategic barrier that would cut off Japan from its newly conquered lands in Burma, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. Japan would be starved into surrender. Equally importantly, this plan would mean MacArthur could repay a debt. Earlier in the war, he had been kicked out of the Philippines by the Japanese, and he had promised to return to liberate the country. But the US Navy had a different idea. It would bypass the heavily defended Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, and the Philippines. Instead, it would seize a string of much smaller islands scattered across the Central Pacific and close to the Japanese homeland. Rather than a barrier, the US would have a series of strategic bases from which to attack Japan's supply lines. They argued it would be swifter and much more economic. The American military command put off the decision. Both the Army and Navy were told to go ahead. In June 1943, MacArthur's plan was launched. It was called Operation Cartwheel. The first target was the major Japanese military base at Rabaul on New Britain in the Solomon Islands. It would be a two-pronged attack. The eastern prong fought its way up through New Georgia and Bougainville. The western prong battled its way through Papua New Guinea. But the virtually impenetrable jungle and unhealthy climate made progress slow. It was nearly 9 months before the pincers met, and the Japanese base at Rabaul was isolated. Meanwhile, as the US Army took control of the Solomon Islands, the US Navy mustered a mighty fleet. It included the first 4 of the brand new Essex-class aircraft carriers. They were bigger and faster than anything before. The new carriers were equipped with outstanding new planes like the Hellcat and Corsair fighters, Helldiver dive bombers, and Avenger torpedo bombers. Together, they both outperformed and outnumbered their Japanese opponents. The Navy's first targets were the Japanese garrisons on the coral atolls of Tarawa and Makin in the Gilbert Islands. These were close to some of the most important supply routes across the Pacific. For a week, the atolls were bombed by carrier-based aircraft. Then, on November the 20th, 1943, there was an amphibious landing. Makin was captured with little difficulty. But Tarawa was a different story. Reconnaissance had failed to reveal that the water was too shallow for the landing craft. As the Marines waded ashore, they came under intense fire. The island was honeycombed with fortified machine gun nests. US troops who made it to dry land were pinned down on the beach. By the end of the day, over 1,500 of the 5,000 US Marines landed had been killed or severely injured. Over the next 2 days, frontal assaults pushed the Japanese back inch by inch. Very often, only flamethrowers could eliminate the Japanese strongpoints. It took 3 days before the last pocket of Japanese resistance was wiped out. Of the 4,200 Japanese troops on the island, only 17 were captured alive. Tarawa was a terrible forerunner of what was to come. The Japanese had shown that there would be no question of surrender. They would fight to the death. It was a grim prospect. In January 1944, America's naval offensive in the Pacific moved onto the Marshall Islands. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the U.S. naval commander in the Central Pacific, was anxious to avoid another bloodbath. So, aircraft from his carrier force bombed Japanese airfields on the islands for nearly 2 months. Finally, on February the 1st, 1944, he sent in the assault forces. The flat and open island of Roy was quickly overrun. But the islands of Kwajalein and Namur were wooded, and the Japanese resisted fanatically. The US forces used flamethrowers and explosives. The Japanese responded by launching suicidal banzai charges. But the US forces now knew what to expect. The Japanese were beaten back. Over 8,000 Japanese soldiers died for the loss of less than 400 US lives. Atoll after atoll in the Marshall Islands now fell to the US advance. Kwajalein was followed by Enewetak. The island of Truk was bypassed and cut off. Though a small Japanese garrison would remain undefeated until the end of the war. The way was now clear for the next push, 1,000 miles west towards the Mariana Islands. If captured, the islands would put the Japanese mainland within range of US heavy bombers. They would also enable America to block Japan's supply lines from Southeast Asia. On June 11, 1944, the US started to soften up the 3 main islands in the Marianas. Four days later, Marines stormed the beaches of the northerly island of Saipan. This time, the terrain was mountainous, with many caves, and the preliminary bombardment had not disrupted the Japanese defenses as much as had been hoped. Nevertheless, by the end of the day, the American bridgehead was secure. In Tokyo, the news caused mounting alarm. The Japanese High Command now sent a carrier fleet to rescue the situation and save the Marianas. But the task force was spotted by US submarines. The Americans sent their main carrier force to intercept the Japanese. On the morning of June the 19th, 1944, the Japanese launched airstrikes against the US ships. But US radar saw them coming. "450 fighters were scrambled to intercept the Japanese planes. It turned into the largest aircraft carrier battle ever fought. The US task force had 15 aircraft carriers and more than 900 aircraft. Ranged against it, the Japanese had 9 carriers and nearly 500 aircraft. But Japan had lost many of its experienced air crews during the Solomon and Marshall Islands campaigns. Its novice pilots faced battle-hardened US flyers. The Japanese were outgunned and outfought. It would go down in history as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Half an hour into the battle, a torpedo from a US submarine hit the newest and largest Japanese carrier, the Taiho, while she was still launching aircraft. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had claimed its first major victim. At around the same time, another US submarine torpedoed the carrier Shokaku. She was completely destroyed. Nevertheless, the Japanese commander decided to continue with the operation, hoping to stop further US landings in the Marianas. For much of the following day, the US forces tried to pin down the exact location of the remaining Japanese carriers.
Bearing 096.
It took them until the afternoon to find them. It was late in the day to launch an attack, and the aircraft would have to fly at the limit of their range. But the US Task Force commander, Admiral Mark Mitscher, decided to gamble and attack. A third Japanese carrier, the Hayo, was hit and sunk. The Japanese had lost over 300 aircraft. But as the US planes now returned, dangerously short of fuel, they ran into a problem. In the gathering darkness, they couldn't find their own carriers. Many ran out of fuel and had to ditch in the sea. Mitscher, in an act of extraordinary courage, ordered his carriers to switch on their lights to guide in the returning aircraft. Fortunately for the Americans, there were no Japanese submarines to see them. Nevertheless, over 80 US planes were lost, either through having to ditch in the sea or through crashing while they landed. But Japanese losses had been even greater. 3 carriers and most of the aircraft needed to equip its remaining carrier fleet were gone. From now on, the United States Navy would dominate the Pacific, striking when and where it wanted.